You know, as we think about education in the 21st century, we know that the analog approach of the 20th century has been stressed. It's at the breaking point, and then comes COVID. So digital transformation of education is now more important than ever. Our next speaker has played an active role in 10 enterprise digital transformation programs and actually created a digital transformation course for the University of Toronto. And he currently holds the role of Chief Digital Officer at Convergence and Tribe. Please join me in welcoming Guy Pearce.
Thank you very much, Jay, and to Minister Lecce for his introduction. And welcome everyone to a brief perspective of the global digital imperative in education in a year of historical disruption. The pandemic has almost forced everyone to reflect on and to implement digital, but where to in education, as to through the lens of our 2 decades of experience in digital transformation. Given the compulsory dive into the digital deep end during the pandemic, let's take a more gentle walk through some of the technology trends in the sector, contrast these with some of the findings from our recent survey that many of you might have responded to, and highlight 3 types of responses to these trends. If you'll give me a moment, please, to share my screen. All right. So right off the top, I really think if I had to summarize what's happened these last couple of months, there's 2 words that come to mind: courage and tenacity. Certainly, it's taken huge courage on the part of the education sector to make decisions under huge uncertainty. There's absolutely no doubt about that. There's no direction. It landed on us. Things needed to happen, and things have happened. And for all intents and purposes, things have happened reasonably well. But there's one attribute that I'd really like to call out, and that's the attribute of tenacity. And maybe it's just anecdotal, and maybe it's just about my son, but I really also want to thank educators for bringing everyone along on this journey. I know my son was a little taken aback in the whole digital transition, missing his homework. And if it wasn't for a teacher rattling us 3 times and saying, "Where's Aiden's homework? Where's Aiden's homework?" he might have fallen behind. So certainly the tenacity on the behalf of educators under an environment of huge uncertainty, I certainly myself as a parent have got a lot to be thankful for how the sector has actually taken this all forward. I think what's quite interesting at a global level, look at what the United Nations have to say. I mean, they're almost proposing that this whole thing, all of the school closures, could lead to a generational catastrophe. That's their words, where 1 billion students are affected by school closures in 160 countries. Sure, there's decisions that need to be taken, but if there's one thing that's sure is that there's going to be a lot more courage than ever to take this journey forward. And one thing is certain, digital will play an increasing role in part. Certainly will play an increasing part in all of it. So which direction do we go in? Right, the first thing, and actually there's quite a lot of research on the bigger trends. And generally speaking, it's your classroom devices, redesigned learning spaces, artificial intelligence, personalized learning, gamification, and augmented reality in particular versus virtual reality, and of course the hybrid mixed reality. But I think what's interesting is not so much what the trends are, but it's what you had to say about those trends. So let's have a look at some of these. In our survey for classroom devices, at least 89% of you said, yep, we have that, we've done that, that is something that we have in place. So no particular concern there. There's a green light, straight on trend. For redesigned learning spaces, again, 86% of respondents said, yep, we're doing that. That's certainly on trend. And by the way, the survey respondents, as Jay highlighted, from around the world. So it's really, it might not be a fabulous survey, and it's certainly more indicative than absolute, but it does give us a good idea of where everyone's at. In terms of artificial intelligence, though, up to 69% of respondents said it is not deployed. And I'm looking forward to Suzanne's talk after this on AI in education, and maybe that helps close this gap a little bit. In terms of personalized learning, at least some deployment in 86% of respondents, so also roughly a green light. In terms of gamifications and simulation, about 2/3 of respondents claim to have implemented some form of gamification. And finally, in terms of augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality, around about half of the respondents say, nope, we haven't deployed anything in this space. So what happens now? So there's a couple of ways we can look at this. The one thing is, do we go where everyone's spending the money, where the investments are being made? So in this particular case, and it's pretty hard to find the size of the markets for these different kinds of technologies. And this particular example here is European in particular. But by far the smallest two markets are augmented reality and virtual reality, as well as AI. And in particular, you know, certainly last week while doing some homework for this presentation, it looks like one of the most exciting spaces, but it's the smallest market right now, and it takes huge effort to actually put it in place. There's AI, also exciting. It's the next smallest market. And of course, your massive open online courses, they've been around for quite some time now. They're really starting to mature, but they're increasing in relevance, and the competition these are beginning to offer even to established educational institutions is quite telling. Personalized learning, we spoke a little bit, but it's interesting that this, picture from the Sustainable Development Goals points out on the focus on data in the personalized learning space, not just the technologies, but what are you going to do with the data, and how, you know, how do you continue refining what it is that you're doing if you're not actually appropriately gathering the data? And we'll touch on this a little bit more later. And finally, by far the biggest market, and it's certainly the oldest one, is the whole education management space versus content. And you know, as I'm saying, I'm not saying that it's the biggest. It's certainly relatively easier than the augmented reality side, but this has probably been around almost as long as at least the PC, maybe even the mainframe if we go back a bit further. So that's one way. If we had a look at this, we'd say, all right, let's focus on education management. Not sure that gives us all the answers. Let's have a look a little bit more, a little bit deeper. The second one is to look to the students. And the second speaker, the first speaker after Suzanne, and that's Patty. She's done some fabulous stuff in this space where students actually, you know, there's a leverage of the expertise in leveraging technology and in really growing that whole teacher-learner collaboration space. A lot of the technologies really are free to use, whether it's gamification, AI, augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality. And the key thing here is to experiment. If there does come a point where, wow, there's something real, it even gives potentially the students who might have experimented the most with it an opportunity to even commercialize and to spin off their projects, which certainly starts encouraging things like entrepreneurship. I think the big thing here, though, is, you know, on the one hand, look to the students. And in fact, there's a whole lot of academic papers in this area, even. There's one here from 2019. One thing that would be useful is, what is the strategy? What is the strategy behind this? Or do we leave it, you know, open for all? Because without a strategy, it becomes really hard to direct the specification of the enabling technology from both an IT architecture and from a data architecture perspective. Then there's a third approach, and it is one that is close to the heart of Convergence. This is how we approach our clients. Certainly, what's the problem statement? And there's by no means we pretend that you did not know the problem as educators or as policymakers or even as students. You know it as well as anyone. But the big thing is, what is the strategy? A strategy is needed to prevent everyone doing their own thing, starting in a different place, having different outcomes, having inconsistent technologies. But some of the three things at the operating model level that are important is, to what extent is technological interoperability between all of these different technologies important? The other thing is to make sure that the skills gaps, not only for educators, but also for administrators and policymakers, are addressed in what is really a brave new world, especially over the last 5 months. And especially, let's look at the third thing, data, referred to earlier. It's the lifeblood of digital transformation. And there's an important need to focus on this, to limit silos and to ensure quality measurables. That said, there's actually four issues that popped out here. Again, from our survey, 61% of respondents are unclear about a strategy in education. The sum there is pretty much on the graph on the right between the gray and the blue. And that is consistent across educators, educational technologists, and administrators or policymakers. Students think, see a little bit less of an issue, but certainly across the board, there is a sense that at least more than half of the senior stakeholders in the sector are unclear about the strategy. So in the perceived absence of strategy, it does begin to beg the question, so what's happening around technology and what's happening around data? That's one issue. The second issue is lots of technologies. We asked you what kinds of technologies you're using, and you're using a whole lot of them. And in fact, there's an interesting one here, and there's the quote, and I don't want to say who it was, but referred to the technology as a clunky, inaccessible, ministry licensed VLE. Not sure where it was, who it was, or what technology was being referenced, but it's an interesting point. But again, we're talking about interoperability here. If we're deploying all of these technologies, how are we gathering the data in order to refine our approach, refine policy, refine curricula even? And without interoperability, data issues will flourish. There will be issues about, okay, so how do I integrate data between the use of Edpuzzle and Pear Deck, or between Brightspace and Discord? Without actually having that data strategy clear, it becomes really a lot more difficult to figure out how to provide feedback and to decide, well, what are the implications for technology, curricula, policy even, and that's instrumental. In terms of the skills gap, more than 80% of respondents experience an educator skills gap. And again, interestingly, that's across the board, again, on the right-hand chart in blue and gray, whether you're an educator or an education technologist, or you are in administration or policy making, you do feel there is a gap in terms of educator skills in particular. Key question again is, how are you going to close these? And the fourth issue, just in terms of the structured approach, spoken about data, just because data is the lifeblood of digital transformation. If there's not a strategy, if there's not approach, if there's not a consistent architecture across not only the technology, but also across the data, it is going to be really difficult to generate insights and analytics that enable you to refine your course of action, to refine policy, to refine curricula, to actually determine, well, how well is this working? So certainly, from our side, we advocate very strongly to think about the interoperability issues and to think about the data and the nature of the data across systems and how you would integrate these to actually perform the types of reporting and analytics you do need as educators or as administrators or policymakers. In concluding then, a small piece, yep, certainly there's been a 5-month epic of courage and tenacity for everyone involved in education. And as I mentioned, not only for yourselves, but even for students. As I mentioned, even my son, there's been some very real challenges. There were some components that popped out in the survey as well. I did ask a couple of questions around wellness. The sample wasn't enough to really draw fabulous conclusions, but it did seem that students were performing slightly less well under this whole digital imperative compared to educators. And maybe that's something to keep an eye open for, but certainly, the whole wellness conversation is becoming really important, especially from a long-term perspective. You saw the UN speaking about facing very real global problems. They need solutions. Is there generational catastrophe potentially? Don't know, but it's certainly important that we are proactive and we do decide on a clear, directed approach to these things. We discussed 3 possible responses. The one is all of the bright and shiny stuff, new technology this, new technology that. And it's quite interesting that one of our clients actually took a different response to this. They've certainly begun to look at it a lot more from sweating existing assets first, before jumping onto the bright and shiny, new technologies. And I thought that was pretty admirable. and speaking about that more from a corporate perspective and, leveraging assets and making sure there's a proper return on technology investments. And certainly, yeah, to me, that is a fabulous case study. The other response is your student-driven responses. Let the students contribute. There's some fabulous case studies, and I don't know if Patty might refer to some of them, but really I was, really blown away by the kind of things that she and her team have implemented in her area. And certainly from our side, our sweet spot, structure-driven responses, which is entirely collaborative, strategic, and structured, particularly with respect to that, the oil of digital transformation, which is data. And of course, any direction you take, and this is not going away in a hurry by all indications, the sustainable deployment of any response will take a lot more courage and tenacity, but most of all, discipline. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And back over to you, Jay.
Thanks, Guy. Well, first of all, let me say thank you for that terrific overview. You painted a really clear picture of a sometimes confusing marketplace and environment. And, two big takeaways I had is, I loved when you said the key thing is to experiment. And that's great. That's how we're going to make progress. And the importance of interoperability and integration in some of these new technologies that we can apply to education. There is a question in the chat, and I think it's a good one. So I'll read it to you. And it's two parts, but it's related to the same question. And someone asks, who is the intended audience of the topic around what you're talking about? Is it for technical architects, or who is your talk directed to? So help frame it for the audience here.
So really from the perspective of the talk, it is not so much students, but certainly if you think about it from a skills perspective, that is across the board. From the deployment of technology, that's across the board for educators, administrators, policymakers. From a technology perspective, that is the educators again, maybe administrators. In terms of the directional statement, I think that's the most important one. That's potentially policymakers even in terms of, is there a consistent approach? Are we going to start in the same place? Or is it more a little bit, maybe yes, some guidelines, yes, some principles, but everyone does their own thing? As we saw from the response, almost two thirds felt, there isn't that guidance or it's not necessarily that clear. And in my mind, that is certainly something for the policymakers. Certainly in 15 minutes, it's hard to target any particular group, and maybe my mistake trying to do a lot in a very little time. But, to the person that asked the question, certainly I think it's a little bit across the board, but not so much for the students. And students were allowed to also, or were invited to respond to the survey too.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. With that, we will keep moving on here.